I was watching a low-res live stream from Caracas the other night, the kind of feed where the humidity and the tension seemed to vibrate through the screen. There was Nicolas Maduro, leaning into the microphone with an expression that wasn't defensive or panicked, but strangely serene, almost clinical. He uttered 5 words that should have sounded like a desperate plea, but instead felt like a heavy, immutable physical law. I am still president and innocent. What struck me wasn't the audacity of the claim. We've all grown used to politicians bending the truth. But the peculiar silence that followed. There was no scramble for evidence, no presentation of data, no legal defense. It was as if he hadn't made a statement of fact at all, but had performed a piece of linguistic magic. To his supporters, the word innocence wasn't something to be proven in a court. It was a badge of rank, an ontological state that was inseparable from his office. He wasn't defending himself. He was rewriting the dictionary in real time. But then the broadcast cut to a newsroom in Washington, where an anchor was frantically pointing at charts, election tallies, and ironclad evidence of fraud. The contrast was almost hallucinatory. On one side of the screen, you had the old world of liberal democracy, obsessed with procedure, proof, and the burden of evidence. On the other, you had a man who had realized that in the 21st century, procedure is just an obstacle. That instantaneous realization that one side was arguing about facts while the other was simply asserting power left me with a chilling thought. This isn't just about a power struggle in South America. Maduro has stumbled upon a grammar of innocence that is starting to echo in our own elections, our own media, and our own streets. He isn't a relic of the past. He's a seismograph for a future where legitimacy is no longer something you earn, but something you simply proclaim until the truth stops mattering. Okay, let's unpack this. That opening monologue, I think, defines the stakes perfectly for this deep dive.
It really does.
We've been handed sources that dissect this seismic shift in how global power is earned and, well, justified. It's moving away from formal systems, from constitutional niceties.
It is. Our mission today is to explore that erosion of what you could call procedural legitimacy. You know, the rule of law, the ballot box.
And its dramatic replacement by 2 fiercely competing metrics. The first is what the sources call substantive capacity.
Which is just the ability to deliver the goods, right? Whether that's food or bridges or electricity.
Exactly. And the second is narrative sovereignty.
The ability to control the story, to control who you are and why you lead. This is a truly fundamental redefinition of governance, and it's happening everywhere, from fragile states to, established democracies.
So we're going to be connecting the dots between, say, state failure and these capacity traps.
And on the other side of that coin, the spectacular operational success of the developmental states we see in East Asia. I think this whole deep dive really is about defining what it even means for a state to be legitimate in the 21st century.
The core insight here seems to be recognizing that it's all about state capacity and this idea of substantive governance efficiency, that these are becoming the primary drivers of legitimacy.
In what you could call a post-procedural world.
Exactly.
I want to spend a lot more time on that syntax of power we opened with. Those 5 words, I'm still president and innocent. It's more than just a political statement, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It functions as a complete ideological package.
Yeah.
The sources call it the grammar of innocence, and I think that's the perfect phrase for it. It suggests the argument for legitimacy short-circuits the entire legal system.
So how does it do that? What's the mechanism?
Well, what's fascinating here is that the sources pinpoint this as a deliberate act. It's a political self-justification that completely bypasses the need for any external validation.
It's an assertion of what do they call it? An ontological state. Precisely. The office itself confers innocence. So any external accusation, any procedural challenge, it just becomes irrelevant. He isn't saying, I didn't commit a crime. He's saying being president means the category of guilty doesn't even apply to me.
So it's a political move that looks conservative on the surface. He's defending his presidency.
Right, defending the existing structure.
But it's actually revolutionary. It's a rejection of all the institutional scaffolding, the checks and balances that the rest of the world relies on.
And here's the great irony, which the sources really highlight. The West, in its, zeal to promote democracy and human rights, it inadvertently taught the world how to do this, how to execute this legitimacy short circuit.
How so?
Well, think back to the interventions in Kosovo or Iraq or Libya. In those cases, formal state sovereignty, treaties, the traditional anchors of procedural legitimacy, they were actively denied. They were overridden in the name of a higher, usually moral or democratic legitimacy.
That is a critical point. The West established the principle that if procedure conflicts with a higher moral truth, then procedure can be discarded.
And Maduro just inverts the logic. He denies international procedural legitimacy, the validity of a contested election verified by outside observers, in the name of a different higher truth.
Raw, uncompromising state sovereignty.
Exactly. His assertion, I am here, therefore I govern, isn't a legal claim. It's the return of pure factual legitimacy. It's what Max Weber famously termed Macht.
That's a powerful philosophical anchor point. For listeners who might not be familiar with Weber, can you elaborate on Macht? Why is its return such a fundamental shift away from our norms?
Sure. So Weber had these three concepts of power. You've got Macht, which is raw factual power, basically coercion.
Just the ability to make someone do something.
Right. Then there's Herrschaft, which is more like authority, power that's sustained because people believe in its legitimacy. And finally, Legitimität, which is legitimacy that comes from recognized rules.
Constitutions, treaties, laws.
Precisely. And in the modern age, especially after 1945, the global system was supposed to run almost entirely on legitimitary. The return of Macht means that power is just asserted. It exists independent of any formal law. It doesn't require a belief in its righteousness, only in the fact that it exists and can project force. We genuinely thought this kind of raw, asserted power had been extinguished from serious international politics.
But here it is. And it suggests a pretty dramatic post-institutional future. If legitimacy isn't flowing down from institutions and laws anymore, where does it come from?
It emerges from below. It's rooted in visible, tangible state capacity. The source material really emphasizes this. The state's ability to mobilize specific groups, to control narratives, and crucially, to sustain itself and resist external pressure.
So any power can now just proclaim itself innocent.
Provided it has the sheer strength, the Macht, to sustain its own narrative against any opposing claims, no matter how factually supported those other claims might be.
And this isn't just a phenomenon in, struggling authoritarian regimes. The source material draws a sharp parallel here, observing that this syntax of I/power/innocence is coursing through established democracies as well.
That's right. When established leaders reject verified election results, or they just ignore the outcome of referendums they don't like, they're using this exact same logic. They're asserting a kind of higher ontological legitimacy that's rooted in their position or their vision, and it overrides the procedural mechanism that's supposed to govern their power.
So even when established states define their system of governance like calling single-party rule consultative democracy, they're doing a version of this.
It's a variant of the core formula. It's an assertion of legitimacy that's rooted in an existing power structure or an outcome, not in procedural input. It's a very pragmatic, outcome-focused legitimacy.
And if we accept that this pragmatism is overtaking procedure, it really explains the shift in how the world judges a state. We seem to be moving away from the regulatory state model,
which is focused on enforcing rules, preventing market failure,
and moving toward models that are judged primarily by their raw effectiveness, by their capacity to deliver on a massive scale.
And this brings us right to the fundamental crisis of governance. Let's start with the traditional definition of state failure, which, again, comes back to Max Weber. It rests on the loss of the state's monopoly on the legitimate use of physical force.
A foundational concept. But how does that actually translate into day-to-day government function?
Well, a failed state, by this classic standard, just lacks the ability to fulfill its most basic security and development functions.
And that manifests as a predictable list of problems, I assume?
It does. A government that can't collect taxes effectively, can't enforce basic laws, can't provide security across its territory or maintain essential infrastructure. It can't provide public goods like clean water or reliable electricity.
And the consequences are dire.
Overwhelming corruption, the rise of powerful non-state actors like warlords or cartels, internal and external intervention, sharp economic decline, and refugee crises that can destabilize entire regions.
But the sources are actually highly critical of how we use that label, failed state. Why is the term itself so problematic?
It's a complex issue. The term really got popular in the 1990s after crises like the civil war in Somalia. But critics argue it's become overly generalized. It's been weaponized.
How so? It lumps too many different problems together.
Exactly. It lumps together vastly different situations, countries that are simply weak, others that are torn apart by war, and still others that are highly authoritarian but actually quite stable all under one diagnosis.
Which leads to a one-size-fits-all solution.
A one-size-fits-all, Western-centric approach to state building. It's focused rigidly on adopting Western liberal institutions, often with no regard for the local political political or social context.
So the label itself can justify these external interventions based on a blueprint that just doesn't fit the local reality.
Precisely. I mean, a collapsed state, where the central government literally ceases to exist for months or years, is fundamentally different from a weak state, where informal institutions like tribal councils or religious groups are the ones actually providing services and governance.
And calling both of them failed misses that crucial nuance.
It completely misses it. A collapsed state might need emergency reconstruction. A weak state might need its formal institutions to actually recognize and integrate the informal power structures that are already working.
So this sounds like we need a more analytical, less politically loaded framework.
Yes.
And that's where Charles T. Call's gap framework comes into the picture.
Yeah.
How does this reframe the idea of state failure?
Call reframes it not as a binary condition, failed or not failed, but as a deficiency defined by 3 measurable gaps in what a state can provide. It shifts the focus entirely onto operational capacity, not constitutional aesthetics.
Okay, let's break down those 3 gaps, starting with the one that feels most immediate.
The first is the capacity gap. This is when state institutions simply lack the ability to effectively deliver basic goods and services to the population. It's a failure of operational effectiveness.
And we're not just talking about big projects.
No, not at all. It's the mundane but essential stuff. Issuing reliable passports, collecting accurate land titles, maintaining an effective civil service, managing public finances without endemic corruption. When the basic machinery of the state grinds to a halt, you have a capacity gap.
The second gap, the security gap, sounds a bit more like that traditional Weberian definition.
It is, but it's defined more narrowly as a deficiency. The security gap is when the state can't provide security to its people from the threat of armed groups. It loses its effective monopoly on violence.
You can see this gap when private militias control territory, or the police are just seen as another gang.
Or when border regions are completely porous, the state just can't guarantee the physical safety that's required for life and commerce.
And finally, the legitimacy gap. This one connects right back to our opening discussion about procedure versus power.
The legitimacy gap exists when a significant portion of the political elites, or the general public, rejects the fundamental rules that regulate power and the distribution of wealth.
And you see this rejection in things like widespread tax refusal or constant mass protests.
Or political factions choosing armed struggle over institutional negotiation. When a state faces all 3, incapacity, insecurity, and wholesale rejection, it is deeply fractured. So the gap framework gives you a much more granular and useful tool than just slapping on the failed state label. It forces you to focus on building capacity.
That capacity gap brings us directly into the heart of the matter. We are seeing this global shift where people prioritize tangible results over procedure, especially when their survival or their upward mobility is on the line.
Absolutely. The sources give us 2 really powerful, contrasting illustrations of this on the ground. Let's start with Elena in Caracas.
Right. For Elena, who's living in a state with severe capacity and security gaps, the abstract idea of procedural legitimacy, say the precise count of a contested election, it's functionally irrelevant.
Her daily legitimacy test is tangible. It's based on delivery.
Exactly. If Elena's is living in the struggling suburbs of Caracas, her life isn't defined by constitutional mandates. It's defined by whether the local food distribution truck, which is controlled by the state, actually arrives.
She hears a local official who maybe lacks international recognition declare, "We are the only ones who can provide." And while international media might call that propaganda,
she looks at the box of subsidized flour in her hands and realizes they are right. The formal procedure of a fair vote feels like an unattainable luxury, a distant philosophical problem.
While the substantive governance efficiency of the state to keep the lights on for 6 straight hours is the only truth that matters for her survival.
That example perfectly illustrates this concept, that the evolution of state capacity and substantive governance are the primary drivers of legitimacy in these post-procedural environments.
It completely shifts the fundamental political question. It's no longer, is the leader right by the law?
It becomes the brutally utilitarian. Is the leader effective by the stomach and by the grid?
And if the state is the only one providing the means of survival, its legitimacy is self-reinforcing, regardless of international condemnation or legal procedure.
And the second analogy takes this capacity shift out of crisis mode and puts it into a context of aspiration and upward mobility. This is the story of Mateo the engineer, whose metric of success is built of steel and concrete.
Mateo's story is really about a generational change. His father's generation might have spent decades campaigning for abstract procedural reforms, democratic rights.
Reforms that ultimately failed to deliver basic functional infrastructure or economic opportunity.
Right. But Matteo represents a younger generation that is entirely outcome-focused.
As an engineer working on a massive high-speed rail or bridge project, he looks at the finished infrastructure, the steel girders, and says, "This is my ballot." That statement is so profound.
It is. For him, the political procedure of voting is secondary. The core metric of success is the tangible industrial output and physical infrastructure development that directly allows him to participate in a thriving economy, buy a home, and see his children move up the social ladder.
That utilitarian, results-driven perspective really confirms this global shift.
Yeah.
The brand of democracy loses all its luster when it fails to deliver physical, tangible results.
For millions of people across rapidly industrializing parts of the world, the truth of government effectiveness is built of functioning supply chains, reliable electricity, and high-speed transit. And this is precisely why the developmental state model, which ruthlessly prioritizes this kind of capacity, has become so influential.
Let's dive into the mechanics of that model, the developmental state. Where did this concept even come from, and how does its purpose fundamentally differ from the regulatory states of the West?
Well, the developmental state concept was first seriously formalized by a scholar named Chalmers Johnson. He was focusing primarily on post-World War II Japan. He was studying the incredible success of its Ministry of International Trade and Industry, or MITI. It basically guided Japan's industrial recovery and its rise to global economic power. Johnson defined the developmental state as one explicitly focused on sustained economic development, and it takes all necessary, often aggressive, policy measures to accomplish that single goal.
So we contrast this with the regulatory state like the U.S. model, which governs primarily by setting and enforcing the rules of the game.
Right. They regulate banking, ensure anti-monopoly laws are followed, protect public goods, provide services like education. Their goal is market efficiency and fair play.
The developmental state, on the other hand, intervenes directly and extensively in the economy.
It's characterized by strong state planning, centralized resource mobilization, and targeted industrial policy. That's why it flourished in late industrializers. Their goal isn't just to manage the market, but to actively create, promote, and guide the growth of new strategic industrial sectors. They pursue industrial policies, which is something regulatory states usually shun as picking winners.
So how does this intervention work in practice, and how is it even justified when it inherently distorts the market?
Well, the state invests and mobilizes capital into strategically chosen industrial sectors. The ones they project will have the highest value added and the biggest spillover effect for the national economy.
And critically, the sources emphasize that the stability of this model relies on intense cooperation between the state and major industries.
It does. And a key mechanism here, articulated by Alice Ampton, is the practice of deliberately getting relative prices wrong.
That phrase, getting relative prices wrong, I mean, that sounds like economic heresy to any free market theorist. Can you unpack what that means?
It means the state systematically manipulates market signals to benefit strategic domestic industries, even if it defies short-term market logic.
Yeah.
For instance, if the global market price for steel is X, the government might ensure that its domestic producers can get raw materials or capital at a price significantly lower than X.
How do they do that? What are the policy tools?
They use a variety of tools. They grant targeted subsidies, often linked to export performance. They aggressively control the exchange rate, often keeping it slightly undervalued to make their exports cheaper abroad. They might manipulate inflation or suppress wage levels in certain sectors to lower production costs.
So these are all hidden subsidies and incentives.
They function that way, yes. Artificially low interest rates, controlled currency, targeted subsidies. It's politically risky because you're sacrificing short-term consumer gains for long-term national industrial gain, but it's often very effective for rapid, late industrialization.
And to implement such long-term politically difficult policies, the state structure itself must be insulated from immediate political backlash. Which brings us to a crucial element, the autonomy of the bureaucracy.
This is the organizational genius of the model. In successful developmental states, particularly in East Asia, the economic planners are typically bureaucratic elites. They are meritocrats, often recruited through these rigorous national exams, and they are largely insulated from the political volatility of elections or the short-term lobbying of the private sector.
So because they aren't worried about getting reelected next year, or about immediate corporate profits.
They can commit to a 10 or 20-year national economic plan.
Exactly. This design insulates them from the short-term or narrow interests of the corporate class or the working class, and that allows them the political freedom to execute painful but necessary long-term national economic planning without disruption from the political cycle. This disciplined long-term vision is a major factor in explaining the spectacular growth rates we've seen in East Asia. Let's look at the results. When we talk about spectacular economic growth, what are the metrics? What are we actually talking about here?
The evidence is pretty undeniable. Look at the post-WWII performance of Japan, South Korea, China, Singapore. Historical data shows that during the Industrial Revolution, it took England about 60 years to double its economy. It took the U.S. about 50 years during its late 19th century takeoff.
Okay.
Yet, several of these East and Southeast Asian countries have shown the capacity to double their economies in cycles as short as 10 years. And China, specifically, was the world leader in economic growth from 2001 to 2015.
Let's use South Korea as a prime example of a state actively shaping the market to achieve these capacity goals. They didn't just stop at light manufacturing. They pushed really hard into heavy industry.
Right. Following the 1961 military coup, Park Chung-hee institutionalized the model. He created centralized bodies like the Ministry of Trade and Industry and the Economic Planning Board, and they directly channeled state effort toward export-oriented growth.
In the 1960s, that meant leveraging low wages for things like textiles.
It did, but the real transformation came when they decided to build global industrial giants, the chaebols.
Correct. In the 1970s and 80s, the government mobilized enormous state financial resources for the rapid growth of heavy and chemical industries. Think of steel production with POSCO, or shipbuilding with Hyundai.
And the government supported these massive business groups through various subsidies, right? Like long-term, cheap loans and credits designed to boost their global competitiveness.
Exactly. And crucially, they also strategically manipulated foreign exchange rates to stimulate exports and allowed raw materials needed for these industries to be imported at a lower cost.
This sounds like a textbook example of deliberately getting relative prices wrong, prioritizing massive capacity building over strict free market adherence.
It was a conscious national project. And as a result, South Korea's GDP per capita exploded, and its industrial production share grew dramatically. The direct government involvement created the conditions for this rapid growth, which, for the generation represented by our analogy of Matteo the engineer, provides the core legitimacy the state needs. Singapore offers a slightly different but equally powerful case study achieving developed country status in less than half a century, and they do it without any natural resources.
Singapore's geography just dictated urgency. They needed stability and specialization to survive. The government structured the country as a developmental state immediately after independence in 1965.
And their initial strategy was simple: provide cheap, highly disciplined labor and political stability to attract massive foreign direct investment.
Right, and they ensured that disciplined labor environment through a really unique system. The only sanctioned labor union was effectively directed by the ruling party, the People's Action Party, or PAP-AP.
So that ensured industrial stability and predictable labor costs, which was a huge draw for multinational corporations.
It was. But they knew that relying only on cheap labor was unsustainable for long-term growth.
So the state stepped in again and proactively engineered the labor market to match its future industrial plans.
Precisely. They launched comprehensive education reforms. They created institutions like the Vocational and Industrial Training Board, the VITB, in 1970. And this wasn't just about general education. These programs were meticulously designed to match workers' skills directly to the market labor demand as planned by the government.
So they were orchestrating the supply of skilled labor to meet their own planned industrial demand,
ensuring maximum efficiency and minimal skills gaps. This level of coordinated planning across industry and education is just unimaginable in a typical regulatory state.
And Thailand provides a fascinating look at how these states manage the twin pressures of protectionism and attracting foreign capital.
Thailand's approach was focused on import substitution, nurturing their nascent domestic industries. And to protect these less mature industries, they often enforced extremely high tariffs, sometimes 80 to 150% on imported goods that competed with their new domestic production.
And that requires a strong state, one that's capable of resisting intense internal lobbying from wealthy citizens and businesses who would probably prefer cheaper imports.
It does. But they also needed foreign money and technology, so they used policy levers to mandate beneficial terms.
They would offer assistance to foreign auto industries, for example.
But only if they formed joint ventures with Thai companies. And the critical rule was often the 51% rule, which mandated that a Thai company had to retain 51% controlling interest in that joint venture.
So it was a strategic capacity building policy.
Absolutely. It ensured that jobs were hired locally, taxes were paid domestically, and profits largely remained within the country, even as foreign investment flooded in during the 80s and 90s. This required the state to have the political will and legal authority to resist those external demands from multinational corporations.
It's clear this capacity-focused philosophy isn't just limited to large national governments. The sources bring up local developmental states, applying the same principles at a municipal level in Latin America.
Medellin, Colombia, is the classic example here. The city administration leveraged its ownership of the municipal energy and utilities provider, Empresas Públicas de Medellín, or EPM.
Right, and they made the deliberate developmental choice to divert a massive 30% of EPM's annual profits into funding municipal spending. They basically turned a publicly owned utility into an engine for capacity building.
30% is an enormous share of utility profits to redirect, and it translated into tangible capacity and legitimacy for the city government.
How so?
It funded sweeping social and infrastructure projects that prioritized the city's poorest areas. It built the city's metro, its bus network, and famously, the Metro Cable system cable cars that connected the steep, impoverished barrio communities directly to the city center and the metro grid.
Which enhanced mobility, drastically cut commute times, and created opportunity.
They complemented that with cash grants, Medellin Solidaria, and other social programs, and they actively sought to build entrepreneurial capacity from the bottom up.
Right, through the Culture E program.
Absolutely. This involved establishing publicly funded business support centers, CIGEZOs, in the poorest areas. These centers provided free business support, technical advice, and training. And that was paired with the Banco de las Oportunidades, which offered microloans, often up to $2,500 at cheap interest rates, to local entrepreneurs who had good ideas but no capital.
The goal was clear: overcome financial and knowledge barriers to entry to develop the local economy through these microenterprises.
It was pure developmental state philosophy applied locally. And they achieved a huge growth in the number of microenterprises, creating a sense of inclusion and dynamism. However, the sources rightly caution that this model often faces inherent scalability issues.
Meaning?
Well, while the microenterprises flourished in number, very few managed to evolve into larger, small, or medium businesses because the necessary regional demand often didn't exist to absorb increased production. This led to high failure rates and unmanageable debt for many of the owners. But the principle remains. Capacity is the core metric.
So if a state's legitimacy is derived from its capacity to perform, then successful powers need a grander ideology to articulate their purpose on the world stage. Something bigger than just GDP numbers. And this brings us to the ideology of civilizationalism.
This is where identity becomes a geopolitical tool. Civilizationalism replaces the post-World War II concept of nations, states defined by a shared culture and territory within fixed borders, with much grander, historical, multi-ethnic civilizations.
It's a form of pan-nationalism, then.
Driven by powerful, multi-ethnic superstates that require a unifying narrative that's larger than simple nationhood to contain their diversity and justify their global role.
And the rise of this ideology is inherently linked to the geopolitical shift away from unipolar Western dominance. The sources note that the undeniable decline of Western liberalism stems directly from the relative decline of the U.S., its main standard bearer.
Power legitimizes ideology. The military and economic might of the U.S. historically legitimized the liberal democratic model around the world. But if an alternative, highly effective model like China's technocratic authoritarianism, which excels at capacity building, demonstrates superior economic and social triumph,
then the ideology of the prevailing power gains legitimacy.
And the ideology of the declining power becomes discredited both internationally and increasingly domestically. The narrative reflects the perceived success on the ground.
Let's look at the key players asserting this new identity, starting with China. It frames its political project not just as a state, but as a continuous, unique civilization state spanning 4,000 years.
The emphasis on historical continuity is paramount. Figures like Zhang Weiwei assert that China isn't a nation-state in the European sense, but a continuous civilization state drawing deeply on ancient traditions and wisdom.
And this framing serves multiple purposes.
It does. It suggests a logical, long-term, cyclical approach to governance and political philosophy that is inherently stable and resilient. A resourcefulness that Western systems, characterized by short-term political cycles and constant ideological churn, are perceived to have lost. It roots their modern economic success not in some sudden change of policy, but in an unbroken chain of cultural authority.
Russia defines itself in similar, though deliberately hybrid terms, emphasizing its role as a state civilization that sits between Europe and Asia.
Right. Russia defines itself as a state civilization reinforced by the unifying strength of the Russian people, language, culture, and its traditional religions. And it's crucial that they include the Russian Orthodox Church, Islam, Judaism, and Buddhism in that.
So this identity is specifically designed to emphasize Russia's multi-ethnic history and its distinct hybridity. It's both European and Asian, neither fully East nor fully West.
Exactly. Vladislav Surkov, a former high-level advisor, famously described Russia as a charismatic, talented, and lonely half-breed nation, a unique civilization that absorbed and synthesized elements from both continents. It's a claim to ideological autonomy.
And what's truly striking is that this language is now bleeding into the Western discourse itself. Prominent European leaders are adopting this vocabulary, which suggests they recognize the ideological power of this civilizational framework.
Yes, the sources quote President Macron, who has mused that China, Russia, and India are not merely large economic rivals, but genuine civilization states that have fundamentally reshaped political order and political thinking, often with a great deal more inspiration than we have.
And he noted that they take a logical approach to the world. They have a genuine philosophy, a resourcefulness that we have to a certain extent lost.
This is a significant intellectual concession. He's acknowledging that the battle has shifted from a procedural critique, are your elections fair, to an ideological critique. Does your system have the stability and philosophy to succeed in the long term? Macron actually warned his audience that Europe will disappear if it doesn't forge its own collective narrative for civilizational renewal.
A grand narrative like that needs protection, which brings us to the concept of narrative sovereignty.
Narrative sovereignty is the ability of a nation to control how it is perceived internationally. We're talking about soft power, but the sources treat it as a hard existential necessity. It's critical to a nation's autonomy and its capacity for self-determination.
Why is it now considered existential?
Well, historically, colonial powers used narratives to justify exploitation, portraying colonized nations as primitive or incapable of self-governance. Today, this continues in more insidious forms, where international organizations and global media often frame narratives that align with external geopolitical and economic interests, and that often undermines the local state.
And the data on global media coverage suggests this narrative environment is profoundly hostile, particularly to developing nations.
The studies cited in the sources are striking. An analysis of coverage from leading Western outlets showed that over 70% of articles portrayed developing nations negatively, with a heavy emphasis on conflict, corruption, or poverty.
And this skewed framing creates an image of instability and risk, which has direct, tangible consequences.
It does. Countries frequently portrayed as unstable or corrupt attract 20 to 25% less foreign direct investment than their peers, regardless of their actual economic reforms or growth rates. Foreign actors become the architects of perception.
So by controlling the narrative, external actors can erode trust in domestic institutions and subtly manipulate policy discourse without ever firing a shot.
Exactly. If a nation fails to assert its narrative sovereignty, it essentially forfeits its autonomy to external forces. The battle for control over a nation's story becomes the most important border, as the sources suggest. Losing control means fracturing national legitimacy and cohesion.
And we have a powerful illustration of this struggle for civilizational resilience against this external interference in the story of Victor.
Victor's story really embodies the struggle for narrative survival in the digital age. He noticed how his community's history and values were being subtly but systematically rebranded by international NGOs and externally funded media to fit a specific globalist mold.
He felt his traditions were being labeled as regressive by outsiders who didn't understand or even care about the local context.
So his response was to recognize that the enemy wasn't just physical, it was informational. He took concrete action. He started a local digital archive where the townspeople could document and tell their own history, their own stories, without an external filter.
It was an act of digital self-determination.
It was. And it emphasizes that in this fragmented age, the most critical border isn't made of barbed wire or concrete. It's the one drawn around your collective story. Losing control of the narrative, in essence, means ceasing to exist as a cohesive collective people.
And this struggle is just amplified exponentially by the architecture of the digital world.
Absolutely. Digital platforms are the primary vehicles for public discourse, and they accelerate the spread of foreign narratives and disinformation. The sources describe this as a form of regulatory capture, but applied to the entire information ecosystem.
It's not just industry capturing regulators.
It's foreign and elite actors capturing the very platforms and structures through which narratives are constructed and disseminated.
And that happens because the algorithms themselves aren't neutral. They prioritize engagement.
Which means they prioritize sensationalism, outrage, and polarizing content over accuracy or nuance. This systemic bias ensures that foreign narratives designed to exploit these tendencies find very fertile ground. As their faces point out, these digital platforms become efficient conduits for influence operations, enabling powerful external entities to control the domestic narrative with minimal overt resistance.
The result is a profound asymmetry of power. External actors with deep resources and expertise in narrative engineering gain disproportionate influence over a nation's domestic discourse, distorting public perception and actively undermining trust in institutional processes.
And often, the funding sources and methodologies behind these campaigns are opaque, making it extremely difficult to counteract them. This is why nations must invest heavily in their narrative infrastructure, mandating radical transparency measures like the EU's Digital Services Act, and integrating robust media literacy programs into national education, like Finland's anti-fake news initiative.
Safeguarding narrative sovereignty is about reclaiming intellectual and cultural agency.
And ensuring that a nation's story is told by those who understand and prioritize its people's actual aspirations.
We've established that legitimacy hinges on capacity, and we've seen how developmental states successfully build it. Now let's look at the institutional barriers that keep many developing states locked in dysfunction, what the sources call the capability trap.
The capability trap is this problem of states progressing at an agonizingly slow pace and expanding their administrative capacity. They aren't necessarily failing in the spectacular way Somalia did, but they are stuck, often despite receiving billions in aid.
And the key dimension that fails is the government's ability to translate policies on paper into actual programs that affect events on the ground.
That's it. And the sources identify two major systemic flaws in traditional development practices that actively make this trap worse. The first is systemic isomorphic mimicry.
Isomorphic mimicry, that's a mouthful. Break that down for us.
It just means disguising state dysfunction by merely mimicking the appearance of functional states. For instance, a government might adopt a perfect Western-style anti-corruption law or a complex financial regulation like Basel III.
So it looks great on paper for international donors.
Looks fantastic, but the state lacks the actual administrative machinery, the technical experts, or the political will to implement it effectively. It's a facade. Local agents are excluded from building context-specific institutions and instead are forced to adopt these fixed best practice agendas designed by outsiders, which systematically undermines the value of local ideas and solutions.
So they adopt a complex system they can't run, creating the illusion of progress without any of the reality. What's the second systemic flaw?
Premature load bearing. This is when limited capacity states are overloaded with unrealistic expectations and too many complex, high-pressure demands all at once. You can't build a modern, effective state bureaucracy overnight, but decades of development practice, often driven by external funding cycles, demand rapid, radical, and often unrealistic change.
And these twin techniques, mimicry and overloading, are what caused the systematic failure of development, regardless of the massive monetary investment.
And compounding all this is the strange, almost paradoxical effect of foreign aid itself, which often undermines the very institutions it's aiming to build.
This is the aid institutions paradox.
Right. When Western countries delegate massive cash contributions through external mechanisms, they often create institutions that are less accountable to their own citizens.
Why is that?
Because they're funded externally, they face less pressure from domestic taxpayers or voters to maintain popular legitimacy or operational efficiency.
And this aid often gets strategically captured by incumbent elites rather than being used for the public good.
Absolutely. The aid is diverted either for simple self-enrichment of elites. Procurement fraud is common when external funds arrive, or, more strategically, to establish and maintain the clientelist networks needed to keep the incumbent in power. In Kenya, for example, studies have shown that aid allocation was strategically biased towards constituencies that showed high vote shares for the incumbent party. They were using development funds as a political reward.
And sometimes the aid doesn't even flow through the government, which weakens the state's fundamental authority.
That's another major issue. When external military aid is funneled through military channels without proper civilian oversight or diverted to non-state actors, it fundamentally undermines the state's essential monopoly on violence. The sources cite cases in Colombia where U.S. military aid was diverted by the military to support paramilitary groups, which, counterintuitively, led to increased violence and reduced security near military bases.
So foreign aid, by empowering elites and non-state groups, can inadvertently foster corruption and weaken the state's capacity and popular legitimacy at the same time.
That is the implication. Some experts have argued that large, rapid investments are less effective and create greater incentives to capture economic rents through violence. Smaller, more focused, and slower investments, like targeted grants for local schools or health clinics, have proven more effective at decreasing violence and fostering genuine, accountable development.
Which has led some to suggest that a gradual managed decrease of external aid might ultimately help foster long-lasting, accountable domestic institutions.
Institutions that must rely on their own citizens for legitimacy and funding.
So what's the consensus path out of this capability trap? If mimicry and external pressure are the problems, the solution must be locally driven and incremental.
That's where the key prescriptive approach lies. Problem-driven iterative adaptation, or PDIA. This method is designed specifically to counter the systematic effects of isomorphic mimicry and premature load-bearing. It flips the standard development script.
So instead of adopting a pre-made template, you focus on solving real, immediate problems.
Exactly. PDIA focuses intensely on solving locally nominated and prioritized performance problems. It requires creating context-specific institutions, promoting slow, incremental reform processes, and crucially, setting realistic expectations. The process engages a broad set of local agents and decision-makers to ensure that any reforms are practically implementable and politically supportable.
You start small, maybe by fixing the customs department's ability to process 10 shipping containers a week.
And you iterate and adapt based on local feedback, rather than trying to build a perfect customs agency overnight. This builds genuine capacity from the bottom up, based on politically sustainable and locally owned solutions.
We started this deep dive talking about weak states struggling to build capacity. But the sources make a powerful pivot, noting that established, wealthy democracies like the United States face their own unique, self-inflicted capacity challenges, particularly when it comes to infrastructure.
This is the paradox of wealth without capacity. The U.S. is one of the wealthiest nations on Earth, yet it's often unable to build critical infrastructure like transit, energy grids, or housing efficiently. The costs are often 2 to 3 times higher than peer nations in Europe or Asia, and projects are plagued by decades-long timelines.
The sources describe this shift in the U.S. as moving from the muscular state-led development of the 1930s, think the TVA or the Hoover Dam, to today's vitocracy.
Vitocracy is the perfect diagnosis for the core dysfunction. It's a system where procedural requirements, legal complexity, and opposition from organized interest groups routinely override broader public or strategic interests. Instead of power being centralized for effective action, it becomes highly fragmented and dispersed among hundreds of veto points. The capacity challenge here is self-inflicted. It's a procedural strangulation.
What are the main sources of this dysfunction in established states?
The sources identify 4 interconnected sources of this procedural paralysis. First, the environmental review process, specifically the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, has evolved from a necessary safeguard into a series of litigation-prone veto points.
So all intended to protect the environment is now the primary tool used to obstruct essential public works.
Precisely. Secondly, there's the diminished state capacity itself, the sheer loss of internal governmental expertise. The state has outsourced so much technical work that it relies heavily on private consultants for major projects, leading to massive transaction costs and slower internal decision-making.
And the third and fourth?
Thirdly, procurement practices often incentivize low initial bids that invariably lead to subsequent delays, change orders, and costly litigation when the inevitable problems arise. And finally, there is a fundamentally fractured institutional environment that fosters interagency conflict, making coordination on any major cross-jurisdictional project nearly impossible.
So the reform goal for established states isn't just about throwing more money at the problem. It's a fundamental institutional reconsideration to rebalance power away from this procedural obstruction.
It requires aggressively rebuilding state expertise, hiring back the engineers, planners, and lawyers who left for the private sector, while simultaneously tempering procedural hurdles like excessive judicial review and NEPA timelines. It's about rebalancing power back toward government actors who can execute projects in the broad public interest, ensuring environmental and community protections are still in place, but not weaponized for endless delay. It is a necessary move to reclaim the operational capacity that the developmental states managed to preserve.
We started this deep dive with the audacious claim of a leader prioritizing pure power over established procedure. I am still president and innocent. We followed that linguistic thread through the necessity of state capacity, seeing how the ability to deliver basic goods and build spectacular infrastructure provides legitimacy on the ground, leading to the rise and success of developmental states in East Asia. And finally, we saw how these successful states claim a higher civilizational identity, actively battling for narrative sovereignty to protect their story against external institutional interference and digital capture. The core takeaway is this. The legitimacy of a state is no longer a single unified concept measured by the ballot box alone. It has become a compound function measured by three fundamentally different and often conflicting yardsticks. You have procedural legitimacy, which values rules and constitutional inputs. You have developmental legitimacy, which values state capacity to deliver tangible economic and physical goods. And you have narrative legitimacy, which values the state's ability to define its own story and civilizational purpose. We must recognize that the most urgent contests of power today are fought not just in the court of law, which is the domain of procedural legitimacy, but on the new battlefields defined by the capacity of the bridge and the resilience of the collective story. And right now, across the globe, those two metrics, substantive capacity and narrative control, are rapidly outpacing the old law book.